So now that we've kind of covered the basics of it, I would like to look at a couple of case studies to really help our viewers understand, well, what does this look like in practice?
Always very helpful.
Great. So the first case, we're going to look at Yesenia. And here's Yesenia's background. She was born in the United States and attended Headstart for 1 year where she had some instruction in Spanish. And that's very fortunate. She attended a bilingual kindergarten until December of that year and then moved to a school that had no bilingual programs. She continues in an English-only program as a first grader. Her language proficiency scores, so her English language proficiency score on the Woodcock Muñoz test indicates that she's at a level 3 in English. And that has a parallel assessment in Spanish. The Woodcock Muñoz indicated that she was at a level 3 in Spanish. So just by looking at her levels on that 5-point rubric, 1 being that silent pre-production period, 5 being fully proficient, she's kind of midpoint in her development of both languages. However, thinking of her background and the home language, which is Spanish, we could probably think that she is slightly stronger in Spanish than in English. So it might be also helpful to look at the raw scores on those tests to see, well, really where at on that continuum is she at in both languages. So she may be a little stronger in Spanish, but looking at the raw scores might help show that she's at one end or the other of that continuum of level 3. Okay, so with that background then, we give Yesenia the first grade DIBELS set of assessments. And first grade, those assessments are letter naming fluency, phoneme segmentation fluency, and nonsense word fluency. And then if we look at the screen, we can see that in letter naming fluency, Yesenia had a score of 27, which put her in the some risk category. In phoneme segmentation fluency, with a score of 30, put her in the emerging category, and in nonsense word fluency, the score of 11 put her in the at-risk category. So across the 3 first grade measures, we can see that she's not solid in any one of those indicators, first grade indicators. Therefore, looking at this profile, we might say this child has some need for some extra instruction. And in some models, that might be perhaps tier 1 in the classroom, some extra teaching. In other systems, we might say, well, she might look like a tier 2. Let's give her a double dose because she's not learning as we would expect grade level peers.
So in other words, they would flip it up a notch.
Yes.
Okay.
However, what I just said, she's not learning in comparison to grade level peers. We have to compare her to her own peers. And not all first grade students, and her peer group being others with her similar background. Her background indicated that she had some instruction in her native language. So we need to address that. And fortunately for us, there is a DIBELS measure, the EDEL, in Spanish that looks at those the same areas in their acquisition of Spanish reading skills. So we gave her the EDEL assessments that were exactly the same, and we found that in the fluidez en nombrar letras, or letter naming fluency, she scored 41, which put her at low risk in that skill in her native language. And in fluidez en la segmentación de fonemas, or phoneme segmentation fluency, a score of 53 put her in the established range. And in the last measure, fluidez en las palabras sin sentido, or nonsense word fluency, she placed in the low risk category with a score of 39. Now, looking at this profile, let me ask you, does that paint a different picture of her ability to learn?
Absolutely. Paints a very different picture when you're looking at the results of both of these.
Right. So what this shows to me is that she's a pretty efficient learner. And what we need to do with her is give her a little boost of that English instruction and target the teaching for transfer. Help her to understand that she knows a lot about reading already and how that's going to look in English. And then I think that she would be ready to be in the mainstream English-only program. And let's show what this might look like in progress monitoring. So we have our graph, and we show that we've given her 3 assessments in September, and we take the mid-score of that, and we look to her mid-level benchmark. So a short-term goal at the mid-level, and we draw our aim line. We provide Tier 1 intervention and teach for transfer, Spanish to English, and then we monitor her progress every week. So we do that in October. And for that month, we see that she is doing well. She is actually achieving higher than the expectation or that aim line. So in that case, we would look to continuing that intensity of instruction and then eventually decreasing the frequency of monitoring to once a month. And then we might look at putting her back into general ed without any more support because she's achieving really well. And there we go, once a month, and she is hitting benchmark by mid-year. However, what if that looked different? So we start out with the same scores in September, the same mid-year benchmark, and we begin in Tier 1 with the Teach for Transfer approach. We monitor progress every week in October, but what happens? What does her progress look like?
It looks like she's not doing well.
She's not up to the expectation. So we need to do something different. So at that point, we look and say, well, she's not on track. So we want to implement a different intervention. And in this case, we might move her to a Tier 2 intervention because that will be a smaller group, a double dose of instruction. And we want to make sure to include that oral language or that oracy component for English learners. So it would be instruction targeted to the skill, but making sure that we prepare Yesenia for the language and experiential demands of that intervention. And then we monitor progress still weekly until we see that she's on track. Okay? And then let's look at Margarita. Margarita came to the United States at the age of 1. She attends a bilingual school with an early exit program model, meaning that in kindergarten, it might be a 90-10 model where they get 90% instruction in Spanish, 10% of English. In first grade, 80-20, third grade, 70-30. So what they're doing is gradually decreasing the amount of literacy instruction in the native language as they're increasing the English side over the grade levels. She is transitioning to an English literacy program, though, in first grade because that model may be a more intensive model where they transition them sooner than third or fourth grade. So that's called an early exit model. And her language proficiency scores on the Woodcock Muñoz indicate that she's a level 2 in English and a level 3 in Spanish. Now we want to look, given her background, does that make sense that she would be stronger in Spanish than English? Does it make sense? So given that she comes from a Spanish-speaking home and that she was born in another country, even though she came while she was young to the United States, and she attends a bilingual school.
Yeah, there are many variables that would suggest that that's a possibility.
Right. So we're not thinking red flag, maybe she has an issue, an intrinsic learning issue right now, but this would be a common profile. So let's look at her DIBELS scores. Again, in first grade, 3 measures: letter naming fluency, a score of 27 put her at some risk. Phoneme segmentation fluency, she measured in the emerging range with a score of 30. In nonsense word fluency, a score of 11 put her at risk. So a similar pattern to our first student in that she's showing some need here. So once again, we only have half the picture, particularly since she's in a bilingual program right now. We need to get the other side of the coin. Let's look to see what her EDEL scores are. In fluidez en nombrar letras, or letter naming fluency, her score of 19 put her in the at-risk category. In fluidez de la segmentación de fonemas, a score of 31 put her in the deficit range. And in fluidez en las palabras sin sentido, or nonsense word fluency, she scored at risk with a score of 12. So now as we compare her status in English and Spanish, we might see a different profile here than we did with our first child, Yesenia. And this profile might indicate that perhaps she's not as efficient a learner as Yesenia because she's having some struggles in her native language as well, and her instruction is native language. So she should have benefited more from the instruction by now. So this might be a student that we would want to start at perhaps a tier 2 to give her that extra dose of instruction to help catch her up. So here's what it might look like. We identify that there was a need for support. And we provide that support. Give her the measures in September. And we provide tier 2 support with research-based intervention in the second language. As remember earlier, I said that the intervention language should match the language of instruction. And in her case, that language of instruction is Spanish, so the intervention needs to be provided in Spanish. And even though Spanish is her native language, research is showing us that our English learners in the United States still need that extra boost for Spanish also, because they are really hearing a mixture of languages and they don't get one solid base of English or Spanish. So we need to provide that oracy instruction in Spanish and monitor her progress weekly. Then we do that and it looks like she's making progress. So we continue the intensity of the instruction and monitoring. It looks like she's on track and we're good to go. However, if we find that tier 2 instruction, that she isn't making progress, then we bump it up. And that might mean that we bump her up into tier 3. And we change the intensity of the intervention by increasing the fidelity to that intervention, and it might be a different interventional program. Increase the time she receives the intervention and decrease the size of the group.
So Julie, as your team is considering the different things that are going on with Margarita, one of the things that just comes to mind, in terms of the intervention, is it the team that comes together and says, okay, so Margarita may need a little bit different kind of approach? Do they then discuss the different approaches, evidence-based, and concur, or what are some of the things that go on there?
Yeah, it's really a team decision at every point through the model, but the decisions are based on evidence.